everybody. Welcome back to our next session for accessibility. I am a white woman with dark hair and a white, yellow, and blue blouse. I am so excited, and I hope you had a great time meeting other attendees during the break. Again, I am Megan Oliver. I'm the marketing coordinator at Ellevate Network, and I am so excited to welcome you back to the second segment of the day. Quick thank you to our sponsors again, Accenture, RBC Wealth Management US, Alliant, ABA, Diageo, DTCC, Mamava, National Grid, New York Life, NFP, Robinson & Cole, S&P Global, Suncommon, and Tend Academy. They're the reason why we're able to make this free and accessible for all. So thank you again to all of them. And let's go ahead and get ready. Please welcome our speakers for the next session, Getting Future-Proofed. We have Eden Perry, Managing Director and Head of Public Finance of the Americas at S&P Global, Rita J. King, EVP of Business Development at Science House, Ruth Shaber, MD, President and Founder of the Terra Health Foundation, Sherelle Dorsey, Founder of The Plug and host of the TED Tech podcast, and Shiva Amiri, VP, Head of AI and Data Intelligence at Pivotal Life Sciences.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. Again, my name is Sherelle Dorsey, founder, CEO of Plexus and the Plug, also author of the book, Upper Hand, The Future of Work for the Rest of Us. This is an exciting conversation. I feel like we are constantly living in the future. This topic around AI is everywhere, whether it will replace our jobs or help us live our lives a lot more efficiently. And it's so incredible to be in a room full of experts. And we know that as technology continues to change and all of these sort of externalities that are happening amid a global pandemic, the recession, or perhaps not a recession, we're all still here trying to understand, what does this look like for us in business as well as in our careers? And how do we start to prepare and get ready for what's to come? What does it mean to upskill? And how do we need to start thinking about and adapting to the changing times that are among us, not even just ahead? So we're going to go ahead and dive into it. And I want to start maybe with you, Shiva. And question for all of the panelists at large here. But when you think about the future, what are the 1 to 2 trends you think will be most critical shaping where business is going?
Yeah, thanks, Sherelle, and it's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I always think it's difficult to make big predictions about the future, but I think if we try and extrapolate a little bit, obviously the economy is going through some changes right now, and that will impact technology, how we do things at work. And so I think that obviously, the trend you mentioned, artificial intelligence, and the acceleration we've seen in the last few months is going to make an impact. And I think that I'm certainly an optimist on the issue. I think it will change things. I think it will provide a lot of opportunities. It will help us do better in a lot of areas, scientific, technical, social. So yeah, I think those are the 2 things: the economy combined with technology and the recent advances we've seen are going to be things to look out for and see how best we can optimize on those as we think about the future.
Thank you so much, Shiva. And I understand. I mean, it's hard to make these gross projections right away as things are changing and adapting and getting into the wild here and kind of seeing how folks are taking some of these new technologies and adapting them to their own workplaces. Rita, I would love for you to jump in here and also respond to the question.
I think as humans, we wait until we have a reason to react to something. And so the biggest trend, I think, is toward being more adaptable and flexible. So since 2006, I've been on a mission to redefine the term AI, not just for us to think about it as artificial intelligence, which it is, right? But to also think about it as applied imagination, imagination applied to our relationship with our creations, with each other, and with ourselves. And so my work centers on those relationships and how to rethink them so that we can capture value for humans without ending up automating ourselves.
I'm sure that most of the folks in the audience are really happy to hear you say that. I think we still have this sort of dystopian viewpoint that the robots will eventually replace us. And so it is great to hear that someone at your level, Rita, is thinking about more so that kind of interdependent world in which both humans and machines can continue to kind of coexist in a much more efficient manner. I want to go ahead and toss this question as well here to you, Eden.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me on this panel. I think it's really important. I think there's going to be a lot of great uses for AI and for data technology. Obviously, in my business, it'll help with efficiency. But we're a client-facing business, so there's definitely this need for human connection. And I think as more Gen Z people, and I think about my own children who grew up with technology, and they're so much more savvy about social media and about AI, come into the workforce. I think what I'm actually concerned about is they're especially living through the pandemic and their mental health, and as they come into the workforce, how we support them to be able to connect with people. So that's something that I keep thinking about, and thinking about the people that work for me is, what kind of support are they having at the office as we're virtual and hybrid and doing this whole flex model, is how we're also supporting them and their well-being. Because that the pandemic was really tough on people, and so that's, I think, something we have to be thinking about too. So AI is great. I think it helps with efficiencies. I think the younger people, Gen Z, they're going to probably be really poised to utilize it. But we also have to make sure, are we teaching people how to connect with people as well?
I think that's an excellent point, especially around the mental health component as well, and how that was drastically changed amid the pandemic, and those Gen Z folks who may have graduated, from either college or into high school and didn't get a chance to meet their classmates for the first year or two, and how that completely impacts our social emotional connection and how that then plays out in the workforce. So thank you so much, Eden, for recognizing that and also bringing that point to the forefront of, yes, the great technologies are here. And now we're even having some mental health tools that are powered by AI or some sort of a chat platform. But overall, how do we continue to foster high quality, healthy relationships and mental health within the workplace? So thank you for putting a pin in that for us. And then last but certainly not least, Ruth, please go ahead and jump in here.
Yeah, thanks. And so much to say and think about. In my career in medicine, we certainly saw the automation and use of AI tools for decision support and tracking patients. And overall, there's no question it's a net positive. But as we move into incorporating AI into more places in the workforce, I think it's really incumbent on us to keep in mind that as our workforce becomes more diverse, we need to make sure that the people designing the AI tools are the same ones who can benefit from them, whether it's in the workplace or consumers. And we've all seen, I certainly in my career in medicine, we've seen what can happen when people from one background are designing systems that are meant to serve folks from another background. And we know that AI, if it's designed improperly, can come up with all kinds of bad outcomes. So I think it's really important that we're proactive and including the diversity that we're all craving and want to see in the workforce are actually there at the table designing the systems that are going to enhance the workforce.
Another excellent point, Ruth. I was reading early on in the pandemic how students and workers with disabilities were, somewhat at an advantage, so to speak, in terms of tools now having to be adapted for everyone to be able to access work and the internet. And then, of course, some additional challenges in terms of how individuals with seen and unseen disabilities do access work and in the ways in which those particular tools have to evolve. I want to kick another question pretty broadly here to you all, because you all have different sectors and holds on this. But in that perfect world, in the world that we've actually prepared for and we're talking about today, when we stretch that out 5 to 10 years from now, and we look at the workforce of the next decade, how do we actually start to prepare for it? If we were to say, listen, we have We have our best case scenarios. We are thoughtful about how we're building. We're thoughtful about who we're building for. We're thoughtful about the future of connectivity within society on a human to human level, on a socio-emotional level. 5 to 10 years from now, how do we actually put that plan in place? How do we prepare for that long term? How should businesses, how should leaders be thinking about that? Rita, I would love for you to jump in here.
Thank you. I do think it's the most important question. I think I work with large organizations. I advise senior executives at some of the biggest companies in the world, and I've seen these trends repeat themselves across industries. So I think we need to get pragmatic about what it means to be human and what it means to work in increasingly complex, interdependent environments. So many of the things that people have to think about now are beyond the scope of a human ability to contextualize all the complexity. And so what I see as we capture the value of domain-specific technologies that enable us to think and decide and act differently is it frees humans up in this perfect world you describe. I'm going to just assume for the sake of the argument we're there. In this perfect world that you describe, it frees us up to think in a different way. And I think that what that requires is a more granular approach to aligning people and processes. And that's, we've had to reinvent Science House during the pandemic too, for that reason. So how do you rethink aligning people to a process? So I think the biggest thing people can do for their careers from a pragmatic perspective is to be flexible and adaptable. You're always going to need and have domain-specific experts that will not go away. That may change and evolve over time. But for many of us, being creative generalists who can focus deeply. So from a pragmatic perspective, I recommend continuing to train ourselves in the rigor of deep focus and connecting with people in a deep, pragmatic way, because those connections are still ultimately what's going to create that giant invisible web of humans working together. So focus and deep work, I think, is still going to win the day at the end of it.
Thank you so much. As you were speaking as well, Rita, it made me think a lot about when we think of that next generation. I don't know who comes after Gen Z, so someone may have to educate me on what the new name is. But when I think about now, like my nieces who are, 16 and 15 and 12, and when we look at college options for them, and what they should be studying, there doesn't seem to be a specific degree right now in artificial intelligence or in ChatGPT. I'm starting to hear words that are tossed around like prompt engineering or what have you. So when we're talking about even preparing businesses and workforces for the future, there is kind of this emphasis that education plays a tremendous role in it, whether it be a traditional 4-year degree or perhaps some levels of certifications that even folks today could get. But it seems like there's not a specific roadmap. So as we start to talk about how businesses can prepare, I think there's also kind of this gap of, well, should I just tell my kids to generally go into computer science, or my mentees, or maybe there's someone on my team that wants to go get their MBA? Is there a specific, section or concentration? And Rita, would love for you to answer that. And then for the rest of the panel as well, to kind of tailor your response a little bit, to include that as well.
So picture the world you described, where we've already been thoughtful and we've reached that point. Okay. There will be that first wave of people, which we're experiencing now, who are adept at adapting these technologies. But in that future forward world, the playing field will be leveled because the cost of entry will be low. So how will you shape your career using these technologies, whatever they are at that point? Okay. It's still the ability to deeply problem solve. So critical thinking, as a person who works in technology but has a humanities degree, I have been keenly aware of the absence of humanities thinking. For example, everyone who studies literature, we learn that hubris is the fatal flaw for humans, right? This seems to be missing in a lot of the thinking, right? So there's this critical thinking component that I think is hands down more important than anything else. No matter what else a person studies, it's going to be critical thinking about problem solving, and are you solving the right problem? Who are you solving it for, and how? So the more clear we become as thinkers, the more we sharpen our ability to think critically, the more we will be able to solve real problems at scale for more people. And we have no choice. We have to deal with climate change and automation and all these other issues. So we're being presented with an opportunity to evolve as human beings. At the same time, our creations are evolving.
Thank you. Thank you for that breakdown. Eden, can I ask for you to jump in as well?
Yeah. So I think it's a hard question. So when thinking about this, I would think that as an organization, we really have to think about creating an environment of like psychological safety, that people feel safe to experiment, to try new things. And I think the other thing would be that you want to be an organization where you're learning. We introduced coaching and feedback a long time ago, and it became really clear to us that one, our managers didn't really know how to coach or how to give feedback, but also our analysts didn't know some people weren't open to coaching. They didn't know what coaching was, and they didn't really know how to receive the feedback. And to be a learning organization, you have to train on coaching, on feedback, how to give it, how to receive it. People have to be open to it. So I think you have to move to be a learning organization, to have psychological safety. It's okay to try new things. You don't have to win all the time. You just have to be on this journey of learning and growing. And not everyone has to be the coder or the person who implements the AI. But I think what Rita said was 100% accurate. Like, be a critical thinker, continue to want to be growing, to learning, to expanding your knowledge set, because everything's changing all the time. Like, that's the one thing that's constant, is change.
Absolutely. And I love that you point out that it is a cultural shift that happens. It is embedded in the culture of your organization, and that sets the tone for the agility and opportunity to innovate, particularly around human needs overall. Shiva, would you like to jump in there as well?
Sure. I agree with the comments made so far, for sure. I would just add that, we don't want to think of technology and AI as the other. It's important to think of it as something that's embedded as part of everything we do, whether we choose to do humanities or medicine or technology itself. I think more and more it's part of us. You can just look at our phones. It's almost part of our bodies now, right? So when we go to university, just back to your question, Cheryl, I think, it's important that all of these things people kind of focus on taking at least some courses or, extracurricular work in technology, so they don't feel alienated from it. I think it's important to lose the fear. If we think about it as the other, it's really easy to fear it and think this thing is coming towards us. Whereas really we want to take it and use it and make it a part of us. My background is in biology and computer science. So I always thought of computer science as a complement to biology. So, and it's helped me a lot in my career in that, I've used it to the extent possible to look at biological problems. And I think I hope that young people today sort of take that approach, and they sort of take a look and see that what are the capabilities that can help me, whether it's in literature or, it's in journalism or whatever it is, because I think there's room for technology and AI in most fields, if not all. I think that's sort of what I wanted to cover on that question. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ruth, Dr. Ruth, coming at this from the aspect of health, of course, improving the lives of women and young girls, I'm very curious about what that preparation today looks like and how that impacts a decade from now, with us being very intentional about where we make these investments in order to prepare for what the next generation is going to look like.
Thanks, Cheryl. And I agree with all the other comments, but leaning in a bit to my area of expertise, one thing that we discovered in researching and writing the XX Edge was that diversity in general, and women in particular, bring a type of talent to the workplace that is essential, and that it's in order to retain and cultivate and recruit and promote that talent for businesses to succeed, they need to be flexible. They need to really be intentional in thinking about the pipeline and thinking about what sorts of flexibility in the workplace and benefits and mentoring and all of the things that we know are important to retaining a highly talented, diverse workforce. And we know that when you have diverse teams making decisions, and particularly when women are at the table making financial decisions, that you get better outcomes. And I think that this is going to ultimately be a pull from employers when they recognize how important this is a material risk to their companies if they don't recruit the diversity that's out there. they're gonna lose out. So I think that the types of things that we all might care about around pay equity and compensation and flexible schedules and parental leave, those are all things that employers are going to have to provide if they're going to have the workforce that they need.
Thank you for bringing up, again, not just the diversity component of this conversation and what future proofing really looks like, but also the equity conversation as well. And Rita, I wanna kick it over to you as we talk about this idea of ESG, or environmental, social, and governance factors that are starting to play. We're starting to see more of a trend of these conversations happening within companies. But how does this idea of ESG really support the decision-making around future-proofing a business?
Thank you for asking. I think it's similar to what Shiva was saying about AI being woven into everything instead of being other. A lot of these programs are sort of tacked on. Same is true for culture programs at most companies. Culture is a very poorly understood concept, and it's often over here, and we sort of roll out a program, and so these programs need to be fundamental to the decisions that get made. You can't make a decision that runs counter, to a sustainability principle, for example. So I think as we get more integrated with technologies that help us think more clearly, faster, better, it enables humans to think at a higher level about how these interdependent pieces fit together. And so environmental issues, governance issues, sustainability, these are all things that need to be woven in at the level of fundamental decision making. And so I think we're getting to the point, this crisis point, with humanity, we're so focused on our creations that we forget that it's giving us a chance to think pragmatically about what does it mean to be human and what can we do about it, and how can we move forward more effectively. So I think that all of these things need to be woven at the most fundamental level into the decisions that get made as companies and organizations evolve.
Thank you. And Shiva, I want to go back to something you said about technology being part of us. And there's so many different kinds of debates happening around AI either being destructive and discriminatory, or this kind of vast, wide open opportunity to create new opportunities for equity. I'd love to know where you kind of stand on either side of the fence, and really understand, just even in the industry, as you are speaking to some of your colleagues and other experts in the field, is this idea of equity and inclusivity within technology actually taking place, or are we sort of assuming that that the future will look a little bit more brighter with much more like inclusive tech and a much more inclusive idea of where AI can actually go?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think we all need to play an active role on how we shape this. I think we shouldn't sit back and see, well, let's see what happens. I think all of us have a responsibility to take part in defining what happens in the future of that. I'd like to call this out because the trends are still not looking great for women generally, especially minority women, women of color, and so on. We want more women in that conversation. We want more women in high school level taking an interest in computing. And that will lead to what happens in university and beyond that. If we do, and I do think this is, of course, a lot of models right now are biased. I think there are ethical issues we need to have guardrails in place for. We do need to be careful with that because, where's the line? Is this a slippery slope of guardrails and things like that? This technology is going to grow. And the question will be on all of us on how we want to manage this and develop it in the right ways. There's a lot of thinking of what if this falls into the wrong hands? Well, we already have those problems like that. Technology can fall into the wrong hands now. And so what can we do to put the right guardrails around this with governments and big companies working together and letting the small companies and startups take a role and a say in that, and then allowing everybody else to play a role. And I'd like to really encourage women, young women, to get active in this space and then help move and change that conversation. If you're not taking part, it's very hard to make that case. So that's sort of what I think could make an impact and move these models and the technology more in the right direction. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, and thank you. Really appreciate that. And Eden, I wanna go back into touching in this idea of like government, right, and sort of all of these changes that are happening, on a global scale for sure, but even just most recently. The debt ceiling was the topic du jour of these last few weeks. There's some new deal that was signed into law last week, and obviously lots of changes ahead, which can seem a bit daunting. Can you share a bit more about what we can expect and sort of help root us in this conversation around what we should be thinking about as we sort of face some kind of high level on a federal level, some changes that are coming?
Well, so obviously, inflation is still a big issue. And I mean, I think there's a lot of people who think that there won't be any more rate raising. I think our position is that we still think that rates will continue to be raised because inflation is still a big issue across the country. So that has a lot of implications for our governments because that makes cost of capital is a lot higher for them. There's a lot of labor shortages across the country. So that's difficult for our governments because that means it's harder to have to pay their employees. So it's had a lot of implications for infrastructure. And as you know, in the United States, our infrastructure is not at the best level. I think the last report from the Society of Civil Engineers was, I can't remember, it was a C- or a D, but it's not in the best shape. So it's a lot of implications on our infrastructure. So that's one thing is cost of capital, it's labor shortages. And also, so Ruth, I know you're a doctor, there's tons of labor shortages in terms of nursing. So a lot of problems in terms of the healthcare sector. We actually have a negative outlook on our healthcare sector, and primarily due to labor shortages in healthcare. So we also have a lot of concerns about demographic changes and parts of the country just declines in population growth. This affects the credit in those areas. One thing we think about too is just knowledge transfer with a lot of people reaching retirement age. How do you transfer that? I just had someone on my team who'd been at the company for 40 years retire. How do you transfer that knowledge? So as we have new people coming into the workforce, which is great, you have to think about retirement and the demographic changes as society gets older. So those types of things are things that we're thinking about. I don't know if that answered your question either.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot to think about, right? I think beyond just the advancing of technologies and changing culture, there's a lot of moving pieces around culture changing, especially as generationally things are starting to shift and needs are starting to shift. You touched on healthcare, and we'll go back to you, Dr. Ruth, on this. But you talked about healthcare. When we think about aging, the challenge of the cost of affordability for folks who are serving as caregivers to family members or no longer have the capacity in which to do so. There's so many different factors in terms of how our lives are being shaped by both the kind of natural human evolution of aging, in addition to some of these key issues, as you mentioned, around overall infrastructure, access to high quality water, when we know that there are these like boil notices that happen all across the country because we know that our water pipelines are pretty old. I think almost a century old at this stage. So how does that actually affect and impact?
Yeah, and just even climate change. And right now, I think so many people, I'm outside of New York right now, but just looking out at the all of my kids' activities were canceled this afternoon. I'm sure a lot of people are experiencing this, the fires in Canada affecting the Northeast. So just climate change overall is just droughts, wildfire. There was the front page of New York Times about Phoenix with the not being able to hook up to certain water. I think it was Utah last year where certain communities limiting access to their solid waste. So you just have to start thinking about how much growth can we have. So certain communities, we have demographic shifts because there's declining population. Other places, we have enormous population growth, but how long can they sustain that when we have this climate change and climate shifts of, flooding, drought, wildfire? Can they sustain this population growth? Yeah. And what are communities doing to prepare for it? So actually, it's interesting because population growth is actually, we think of it as a credit positive because, what we look at is your ability to pay back your debt on time and in full. So you need revenues. So population growth is a positive because you're getting more people, they're going to pay taxes. But there's a point when, can you really sustain all of that population growth if you have floods and wildfires and droughts. So we really have to prepare for that with changing.
And just something as simple as power, access to power. I live in Atlanta, and I have been keeping my fingers crossed this entire time because we've had power grid issues. And quite often, at least 2 to 3 times per week, we have 30-minute power outages. And so again, because there's so many more people who have moved into the core of the city and have relocated, that being able to maintain the needs has been a challenge. But also a very interesting opportunity when we think about what does the future of workforce upskilling and development actually look like for folks to be trained in jobs and in companies that may be working to solve some of these issues or mitigate some of these issues, particularly around climate change. And Dr. Ruth, I want to turn to you because I think this is right up your alley. You talk about in your book that women will actually control over $30 trillion in assets by 2030, which is almost just around the corner. I'd love to get your perspective on how this might change our communities. I think Eden again pointed out some very large issues and challenges that we're currently experiencing today, and of course need to be mindful of how this exacerbates in the future. But what are your thoughts in terms of women having access to capital in these assets and how that's going to help us navigate the future?
So much to say. Let's talk about money, and money on both sides, supply and demand. Right now, over 98% of capital is controlled and decisions are made by white men. And the consumers in our, consumer decisions, whether it's in healthcare or other kinds of consumer products or the education system, are largely women. The workforce is becoming more and more female. In healthcare in particular, almost 85% of the workforce and consumer decision-making is made by women, and yet women control less than 15% of the leadership of whether it's the insurance companies or the pharmaceutical companies or the healthcare delivery systems. And so we have this mismatch between the users and the frontline workers and the people making the decisions. And frankly, I have nothing against white men. I think they're great. But we need to diversify the decision-making, because we know that when the folks who are actually at the front lines, either as consumers or as the workers, have the opportunity to be in the decision-making rooms, that you're going to get more sustainable solutions. And whether it's climate change or poverty or population growth, you name the issue that you care about, that you have to have a diverse decision-making in order to be able to tackle those really important problems. We know that not only women are excellent financial decision makers, and the diversity they bring creates more sustainable solutions, but they are much more likely to care about the environment. They're much more likely to think about the social impact of the decisions they make. And that's not just in government or at the local school board. It's at the highest levels of public companies, and certainly in venture capital, in debt, wherever you look at the financial systems, money is what makes the decisions. And Cheryl, you bring up a really important point about the wealth transfer that is coming. We know that women, through either inheritance or through divorce or their own entrepreneurship, are going to be in control of as much as $80 trillion over the next 5 to 10 years. And we know that women as asset owners are much more likely to demand value in the investment decisions they make. So just like myself, when I became interested in philanthropy and impact investing, I demanded from my asset managers that they look at the double bottom line. I wanted to make a ton of money, but I also wanted to make sure that my investment decisions were sound and that I wasn't doing damage, and to the best of my ability that I was having a positive social impact. And those things are quite possible. And I think as women come into their own as investors and asset owners, they're going to demand those things. So the financial market systems are going to have to accommodate them, not only preparing for their workforce, but also for the demands from the investors to meet their values that they care about.
Absolutely. Thank you. Rita, I saw you nodding very approvingly as Ruth was speaking, and I want to toss to you before we go into Q&A, particularly about some of the things that Ruth touched on. I think we're in this space of knowing that these challenges exist. We know that equity is important. We know that women making more decisions will have a net positive effect. But there's a difference between knowing versus actually doing, and getting companies and corporations and leaders to actually do, to promote women, to create more space for this idea around equity. And so I want to ask you, what changes do organizations need to make in order to be future-proofed? Again, more than just technology, but as we look at representation across the board. And where does this idea around talent and human capital actually fit into all of this?
I really thank you for asking. I really think a lot of the comments everyone here has made today kind of connect into this question. If you tie knowledge transfer to it, for example, right? I thought it was interesting when Ruth said that these assets will be gained in part through inheritance and divorce. So what does that say? Are the women who are going to be in control of these assets ready to do something with it if they're inheriting it or getting it through a divorce, in other words, right? So we're almost putting capital control in the hands of a different group that hasn't necessarily had a societal opportunity to grow into that because of the numbers, right? But there's an interesting concept here about knowledge transfer. And I think this is where companies can think differently about this. Knowledge transfer in the industrial era, for example, there was so much waste because people learned from experts how to perform a task, but the task performance was suboptimal. So what I would caution women to think differently about is you don't necessarily want to emulate the quote unquote experts that are here today, because they have a different way that they make decisions in a different context. It doesn't mean they were wrong per se, although sometimes they obviously were. It's more about the context having shifted. So there is actually a benefit to women coming in with a new perspective. And so I would say the important thing is to always keep in mind there's expectations and then there's reality. And when we're trying to conform to expectations that are set before us, we're trying to reach a standard that was not set by women, okay? So instead, again, this is where critical thinking comes in. Sometimes reality can offer more than what we expect. But if we rigidly adhere to what we think we're expecting, we sometimes miss the opportunity to leapfrog right over that in a sense, right? So I think improvements are not coming incrementally anymore. There's a giant leap forward that needs to get made. And I think we're poised to make that leap. And it's going to require an enormous amount of support of each other, realism about what it means to make decisions. It's complex. It's not easy. Power is difficult to achieve and difficult to hold on to and difficult to do something great with it. So I think if you take all of the things we talked about today and kind of put them into one, package, that knowledge transfer is important because we have to know how institutions work. I mean, from an infrastructure perspective, you have to know how to build a bridge before you can build one, right? But how can we make massive gains, not just incremental gains? And that's what I think we need to constantly keep in mind. We're looking to leap forward. We have to. Time is of the essence.
I love that. I'm sorry, did you want to jump in here, Eden?
So, yeah, I just also think we thought it was a good point about like where we want to invest, where people want to invest, and that people care so much about the social impact. But I also think employees care too. I think and more as Gen Z comes on, which I value so much about Gen Z, is that they want to be purpose driven. And I think about it too when I work. Like, what are my values? Why do I want to be here? This is partly why I went into public finance, because I'm a public policy person. I care about what I'm doing. I care about governments and how it works. And I think not just as an investor, but also as an employee, I care about my company, like who they are and what they stand for. And I think because of what happened with George Floyd and what happened in our country, more employees feel this way. And I think a lot of companies have to start realizing that people care about where they work and what the company stands for. And I think that's going to be a big leap forward for a lot of people in the United States to sort of think about. Like, who are you? What kind of company are you? And what do you stand for?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, both Rita and Eden. Very powerful comments, excuse me. I want to go ahead and turn this over to the audience who's who has begun asking some questions here. And so we're going to start with Megan. Thank you so much for asking this question. And panelists, feel free to jump in and just unmute yourselves. But what advice would you give to those who are a little hesitant about AI?
I'm happy to start. One of the things I always remind people of, and there was a pretty good New York Times article about this a couple of years ago about the history of computing and how women were the first first set of employees on this for a long time. It was really considered to be really well suited for women. And then somewhere around the 80s, that changed. And because it became more and more powerful, men started jumping in. So I want to remind people, and women especially, that this is something that women really help nourish and grow. And so to me, it shouldn't be something anybody is worried about, or there shouldn't be a fear around this. But I understand it has become this big thing. And, the best way to get familiar with it is to read about it and try it out. All you need is an email address to try out ChatGPT or Bard. And you'll realize that, there's not a big learning curve there. I think reading about these things is very powerful, taking courses if that's of interest, but really there's like a really low bar now to get your hands on these technologies. So I encourage that as a starting point.
Thank you, Shiva. And my apologies, that question came from Patricia Roberts. The next question we'll move on to, are there any resources you would recommend for people who aren't too familiar with AI to start to understand it?
I think it's critical to understand the problem that you're trying to solve or what you're curious about. When you start, these experiments, what does it add to you? What does it add to society? Where can you start in a way? Everyone's tinkering now. All of a sudden there's a huge mainstreaming of GPT, right? So the bar is low, I agree. And there are some fascinating things you can do with it. So I think people should approach it, a little bit like scientists and a little bit like artists, and just experiment a little bit and have fun with it.
I love that approach, just to have fun. I often go to OpenAI and play with that and just ask a bunch of random questions to see what I'm going to get. And there's just even plenty of newsletters of tools and people just experimenting. And I'm sure just finding even a Discord on the internet to see what kind of things people are doing is a great way to just have a good time. So I love that, Rita. So the next question, with student loan debt weighing down many Americans with a greater adverse impact on women and members of the Black, Hispanic, and LGBTQ plus communities, what are your thoughts on companies helping employees with repayment of student loan debt, or in helping employees avoid it with tuition assistance and with matching 529 plans? Ruth, feel free to.
Yeah, I love this question. And I think it's really, and one of the great horrors of our society is that we have saddled people, some of the best and the brightest, with debt that prevents them from achieving their best selves, whether it's professionally or personally. I think it's just horrible. And ultimately, I would love to see a public policy solution to this. And I know that there are things that we're talking about. But in the meantime, while we're waiting for that to happen, that miracle to happen, I think companies have a huge role to play. And I think this is a great example of how, as an employer, that you need to address what are the needs of any particular talent that I want to attract. And if you want women, if you want people of diverse backgrounds, if you want folks from communities where they haven't had the type of resources to pay off their loans or to go to school on their their uncle's paycheck, then you're going to have to do something to make it worth their while to come work for you. And in my organization at Tara Health Foundation, we have taken a serious look at repaying people's loans, even though this is a great example of equity. It's not equality because you don't give the same to everybody, but you try and level the playing field. We also are interested in helping people advance their education, and it's not everybody doesn't get the same thing. You have to assess what is it that this particular person needs? And I would love to see employers really critically looking at this as a way to optimize their talent. And it's going to come back to them in the returns by having that diverse workforce that is going to make them a more sustainable. It's going to retain the talent. It's going to prevent the attrition that happens when people are saddled with whether it's debt or they have to take care of an aging relative or whatever it is that they need the resources for. You have to think about the whole person and not just equal compensation.
Absolutely, absolutely. And this this last question that we have is pretty right on par with the one that was just asked, Ruth. And this is also for this person asked, what happens to the women who aren't married or who are not guaranteed inheritance? The decision making and flex in the system will come from women, but perhaps a particular type of woman. Will we then be faced with a problem where other intersectional women will not belong or have psychological safety? And I think this is rooted in not every woman has the exact same experience. So as we elevate more women into decision-making roles, are we also ensuring some level of diversity or equity in terms of the kind of women that are in these roles and are making decisions for other women across the board who may have very different circumstances? Any panelists, feel free to jump on to respond.
I think it's a great question. And it's a great question for all of us to ask ourselves. Years and years ago, I ran a smaller team. And I remember saying to a woman on my team, well, actually, she was a peer. She was on another team, a Hispanic woman from Mexico. And I remember saying, when I talk about different ideas, I always talk about being a woman. But I feel uncomfortable talking about being black or people of color or being Hispanic, even though my husband's Hispanic. And she said, it's really unfair of you. It's really, you have a black woman on your team, you have a Hispanic man, and you're only talking about being female. Like, it's really exhausting for the people on your team, the people of color, that you're only. And I said, well, I don't want people to think I'm being presumptuous. And she said, well, do you think about how these people feel every day, that they're so exhausted? You're the leader. You need to show up for them, and you need to start speaking for them as the leader. And it really made me think about belonging and being the leader and showing up for them. And so I was like, oh, but it also gave me permission. Like, oh, okay, I can do that. Like, I'm allowed to do that as their leader and not talk for them, but like try to represent. So I think it's really important to show up for other people. And, if you make a mistake, ask forgiveness, because of course I say stupid things sometimes because I'm human. And I don't know, but we just got to show up for each other. Yeah. And I hope that helps.
Yeah, some willingness to have hard conversations, to get uncomfortable in order to do some course correction and learning. It sounds like there. I want to go ahead and toss this to our next question from Kashmira. Kashmira asked, and I'm sorry, Andrea, thank you so much for that last question. Very thoughtful. This question comes from Kashmira. Kashmira asks, our healthcare system is based on standards of care that were established through research conducted primarily on white male physiology. That has created a massive disparity. And what can we do to encourage more equitable healthcare?
I'm going to jump in and answer this one, if that's okay. And I have some really strong feelings about this. And, as we talk about in the XX Edge, that it wasn't really until Bernadine Healy became in control of the NIH budget. Once again, there's money involved, that there was a mandate that all clinical trials had to include men and women. And ultimately, this has also expanded to include more that researchers have to match the diversity of the cohort they're researching and that they're experimenting on to the population of people that will ultimately use that product. So things have gotten better. There's still huge opportunities for equity in our healthcare system. What in my field of OBGYN, maternal health outcomes for Black women in the United States are horrible. I hate to keep dwelling on the bad things. But one thing that we've learned that makes a difference is culturally matching the people providing care, whether it's midwives or obstetricians or doulas, to the population of people that we're supporting. So we need a bigger workforce of Black midwives, Black obstetricians, doulas. We need to be thinking about the types of ways that people want to bring their own culture into their healthcare. So those are some specific outcomes, specific interventions that we know can help. We need to be measuring the population of people that we're hoping to care for. We need to divert some of the financing money again away from sort of elite high-end care, whether it's elective things, to basic preventive medicine that we've really neglected in this country. And it's really scary how countries with dramatically fewer resources have much better health outcomes because they focus on prevention, because they focus on cultural competency and what are the needs of it. And they go out to people's homes, they provide care in the community setting rather than in ivory tower hospitals where they really can't understand all of the forces, whether it's behavioral, social determinants and the things that really actually matter for people and their families.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ruth, and thank you as well, Kashmira, for that question. So we're going to go to this question from Natalie, and this I think is on everyone's mind. Eden, you brought up, when George Floyd was murdered in 2020, there was also a string of other folks who were murdered by police. There was a lot of social uprising, and companies across the board made over $340, I believe, billion in commitments and promises to this idea of equity. Some of these companies hiring DE&I executives for the very first time and starting to implement new kinds of practices around diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging. There may be different names for different aspects of the work done, but that became part of the trend. And then we started to see, as the market changed, just as early as the fourth quarter of last year of 2022, some of the pullback on some of these initiatives. And so Natalie's question here really fits in alignment with this kind of new shift in focus, whereas 2020, 2021, everyone was like, yes, we need to do better, which I think I've heard here on this panel, we need to do better. But then also the market has changed. And so that now changes our sentiments towards the importance of diversity. So Natalie asked if the core mandate is to enhance the financial well-being of clients, which may quietly imply that most things, including DE&I, are secondary to P&L or secondary to profit and loss. How can we embody DE&I values while still achieving strong returns for our investors? And either of my panelists, feel free to jump in here.
They're so deeply connected, and we haven't yet fully accepted and realized the interconnectedness of those two concepts. DE&I is still treated as a tack on in most companies, even companies that are doing it well. It's nascent, as you said, and it shouldn't be a trend. It should be a permanent new reality. And I think I'll say something a little bit provocative. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Temple Grandin, but Temple Grandin years ago is a person who wanted to redesign slaughterhouses because she didn't like that cows were suffering. But you can't just go to the cattle industry and say, I don't like cows suffering. So she had to make a business case for why improving slaughterhouses was actually good for the bottom line. And she didn't want to see cows killed at all, but she wanted them to be less anxious. And the reason I bring this up is because half of the slaughterhouses in the US are designed by Temple Grandin. And she had a true and noble she is, I think, philosophically correct, right? But she couldn't make her case. And I'm not comparing what we see in the modern corporation to that. What I'm saying is business. And if you make a business case, and I think the business case for inclusion and equity is the number one most pressing, we have to make that case. In other words, humans are humans. And until companies understand that the bottom line is impacted by the failure to implement these policies at the deepest level, there's something diminished about our humanity, in my opinion, and that's just a fact.
The good news is the business case is out there.
Right. I also think consumers and investors forget how powerful they really are, and this is nothing new. I mean, you think about when people divested from apartheid, how much power that had, and so people act like this is so new. This like, oh, sudden people are so woke, and like this whole thing against ESG. This was very powerful back then with getting us to divest from apartheid. So it's not new. So I think once consumers and investors start to realize again, you're actually very powerful in where you put your money. So I think we need to think about that again.
Absolutely.
I just want to add to that a little bit, and to a point that Eden made earlier, and some of the points Rita is making, that, you know, if we focus on impact and purpose in our careers, which I think more and more is becoming important post-COVID, even before that, with the economy, what the fact that the technology sector needs to reassess itself. You know, there's a lot going on that, you know, the political, the political happenings these days. It's just a lot going on, and I think taking into account impact, purpose, climate, politics, purpose-driven work, that automatically means that we need to really seriously think about diversity, DEI. I really don't see it as anything separate. I think it's integrated. We have to participate. Everyone needs to participate, and that's the best way to ensure that diversity is incorporated into the things that we're doing. So hopefully, partially, automatically, this will happen if we focus on impactful and purpose-driven work. But I also think that you know, from an active perspective, we have to take part. Everyone needs to take part.
Absolutely. And as we close out, one of the great questions that we received to close us out this afternoon's discussion is from Joanna. And I'm also very curious as well for all of our panelists. What excites you most about the future? We know there's a lot of work to be done. We know that there's still some minds to change, some things to shift, you know, more gender diversity, racial diversity, ability diversity that needs to take place for us to realize a next decade that is much more equitable. But what really like gets y'all out of bed in the morning and excites you about your work, and what the potential is ahead of us in this kind of new future? And I'm going to start here with Rita, and we'll work our way across.
For me, it's just purpose and unleashing a new level in creativity for problem solving for some of the most difficult problems that we face that have been too complex for us. Our brains are limited. As amazing as they are, they're limited, and we can work together in new ways at a scale of creativity, pragmatic creativity that we've never experienced yet. And I think that's very exciting.
I agree. Eden?
I'd have to say meeting women that are the women on this panel, and women that I was at the event last night. I get very inspired when I'm at forums like this. I'm actually in a field that's since finance, very male dominated. So at times I lose a little bit of my own self-esteem or I feel a little intimidated. So coming to a place like this, a forum like Ellevate, it's just very inspiring, and it brings back a lot of confidence and makes me feel very positive about the future. So thank you.
That's incredible. Dr. Ruth?
I'm the most excited about this opportunity to use capitalism, good old-fashioned capitalism, to solve some of the world's most pressing problems, this intersection between capitalism and justice. And there's a way out of this. And seeing so much creativity, alternative financing structures, ways to think about a double bottom line, that's what gets me out of bed in the morning. That's what I'm the most excited about.
Thank you. And last but certainly not least, Shiva.
Sure. Yeah, I think, you know, I may be biased, but I'm excited about all the potential for AI in many things that we do, including, for example, new discoveries in biology and medicine. We've already seen that happen. There was an antibiotic that was discovered with AI recently. There will be many more of those stories. I'm also excited about the opportunities in education and justice. Education, for example, and justice, if we think about the women in Afghanistan who don't have the right to education, and the opportunity that technology and AI has for that. That's millions of people. And it's also relevant to anybody in the US, you know, the rest of the world, where everyone will have a super patient tutor to walk them through anything they have difficulty with or they can't understand. So I think the fact that it levels the playing field, that it will contribute to discoveries and to justice, I think is very exciting. Thank
you. Equally, for every every response here excited in very similar ways. I want to thank each and every one of our panelists today for such thoughtful and meaningful and heartfelt responses. And I'm just really excited that you all are in the positions that you all are in. I think it gives us some level of comfort and solace that in your leadership roles, these are the conversations you're also having at work and in helping us to shape the generation ahead. And thank you again also to every single person who asked a question here, and we do apologize for those questions we didn't get a chance to respond to, but we definitely see you all, and thank you for even just the positive comments that were placed here this afternoon. And to Ellevate Network, thank you for having us.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Hi, all. Thank you. Thank you so much in return to Eden, Rita, Ruth, Sherelle, and Shiva for an enlightening discussion. And I want to say, if you will pardon the quick promo, Rita is actually on today's episode of the Ellevate podcast. So if you want to hear more from her, you can be sure to check that out. There's also, if you listen back, there's a few of our other guests that you might recognize the last few weeks. It is now time for our Meet the Recruiter Hour at our career fair. You will be able to talk directly with recruiters from RBC Wealth Management, Accenture, S&P Global, DTCC, Diageo, Alliant, and Guardian Life Insurance. You can get there by clicking the Expo button on the left side of your screen, but be sure to meet us back here on the main stage at 1:30 for our conversation about making workplaces more human.